Welcome to the Parenting Power Podcast, supporting parents with the real-life tools they need to raise the confident, interdependent people the world needs. Gail Bell and Julie Friedman-Smith interview experts who share their knowledge to assist parents in creating a home environment where kids can thrive.
Welcome to the Parenting Power Podcast. This is Julie Friedman-Smith.
And I'm Gail Bell.
Today we are speaking with Bell Lap Coaching founder Perri Ford. Perri is a mental performance coach who supports athletes in navigating their paths as they move through the journey of sport. Her passion for athletics and understanding of mental performance is rooted in her personal experience competing, coaching, and training at an elite level. It's great to have you here today to share your knowledge with our listeners, Perri. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Perri, we know that you come from a competitive sports background. How did you get into performance coaching?
Well, honestly, it started from a pretty young age. My parents were both very interested in the psychology of sport and really drove home the point that we had to be mentally prepared as well as physically prepared when we competed. Recently, we were cleaning out some stuff in the basement, and I found a journal entry I had written for a school assignment in junior high saying how badly I wanted to be a sports psychologist. So I think that it has always been in my mind and in the back of my mind that it's something that I'm passionate about. Mental performance coaching is a little bit different in that I don't do any clinical diagnosis, but I still get to be under the umbrella of sports psychology and work with athletes. When I was doing my undergrad degree in kinesiology, I knew that I wanted to do something a little bit more and add on to it. And so when I came home from school, I worked for a few years while I decided what I wanted to do. And a good friend of mine kind of gently nudged me towards sports psychology again. And I ended up going back to school, doing a master's in it, and I haven't looked back since. So it's been a pretty awesome journey, and I'm excited to be where I'm supposed to be now.
Sounds like you were really guided to this path, which is always an exciting thing to hear about. How do you feel the mental side of sports affect an athlete's performance?
In a lot of different ways, and it depends on the athlete. I see so many different personality types in my work, and in some ways the mental side can be of assistance, and in a lot of ways it can be difficult for kids to manage when they don't understand how. So I believe that sport is guided by mental performance and the skills that we develop, especially at a young age. And for a lot of kids, that is the deciding factor between their ability to cope with discomfort and their inability to cope with discomfort.
That's really interesting that you bring up that word discomfort because there's lots of things in life. Real life has lots of different emotions. And Julie and I both coach around that when we're working with families, that the path isn't always smooth, right? So there is discomfort in lots of things. And it's an emotion around it, right? And we have to recognize that emotion and know that it can change. And it just because you're feeling sad now, for example, doesn't mean that you're a sad person, right? So that's interesting that you take that into your coaching as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important for kids to understand as soon as they can that discomfort's not a bad thing, that it fosters growth, that when you feel it in a setting like sport, it usually means that you're getting ready to figure something out about yourself. And so many kids shy away from those feelings of nerves or disappointment because they don't feel good. So I think if we can give them the tools to understand and manage discomfort, then it begins to be something that they welcome when they compete, and that's a huge skill to have in life too.
Absolutely. It translates so clearly for any aspect of competition with someone else as well as aspects of growth for ourselves as an individual, whether it's for a child or an adult, that those times of discomfort are often, as you said, the sign, the flag that's waving that says, hey, here comes some really important growth.
Yeah.
Let's do this. Yeah. It's sometimes hard to run into that and rather than running away. So it's neat to link those and that you give children the tools to step into that.
Yeah, it's pretty important work, I think.
Julie and I often refer to the fact that children actually acquire self-confidence, which grows into long-term self-esteem, when they actually fail at things or make mistakes, and then they're allowed to own it first versus excuses. So to own that, wow, I really didn't do that well, or I failed at that, or I can't do that yet, and then take the effort and the determination to say, how can I change that? Or do I need to work harder? Or what is it going to take for me to be able to do that? And that's actually how children acquire self-confidence, which then goes into, as I mentioned, self-esteem. So that's great that you're working with that with kids in a sporting aspect.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's a lot more worry than we realize about failure with kids. I did an activity a couple of days ago with a group, and they had to anonymously write down worries that they have in their sport or nerves that happen for them and what the thought process is. And then we went through as a group and just discussed it because everybody was kind of writing down the same things and within the same theme. So it was good to normalize that. But every single piece of paper I picked up was something about worrying about failure, worrying about what my team will think of me, worrying that my coach is not going to think I belong there. And there's so much internal chatter, and it's usually related to this fear of failure. So I think when we change the relationship to failure and talk as much as we can about growth, then maybe those fears and worries can subside a little bit and give them the space to perform the way that they can when it matters most to them.
Perri, in your work with these athletes, do you work with athletes of every age?
My youngest right now is 10, and my oldest is actually 62. So I have a very wide range.
Spread.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And when you're working with these younger children, are the parents involved at all? Do you talk with the parent, or are you specifically focusing in on the child?
It depends very much on the athlete. So with my really young athletes, we involve the parents and we do a summary at the end and have a conversation with them. But for most of the athletes that I have, who range probably between 14 and 18, we have a discussion about how much parent involvement they're comfortable with, and then we go from there. A lot of times it's really important to have parents clued in on exactly what we're talking about so that they can use the same language and have the conversations with the kids between sessions so that we're all on the same page and working towards the same things. But I do put the athlete in the driver's seat about how that is going to be shared, how much, and whether they would prefer if I do it or if they want to. And then they get a bit of autonomy and feeling of control over the process, and they're a lot more open to having their parents around and being involved in it with them.
Really upfront and clear, which always works better. I'm curious if in any of those anonymous fear papers, there's something about how their parents will feel if they don't succeed.
Yes, and you know what, that's something that I run into very frequently with athletes. And one of the things that I say first is, have you ever asked them how they feel about this? Because there's so much assumption, and every parent that I work with has their child's best interest at heart. And so a lot of times there's assumptions being made by the athlete that are just simply not true. So we try and clear some of those out too. But there is definitely a lot of worry about opinions of parents and other coaches and authority figures.
That's interesting. That I'm so pleased to hear as a mom of children who play sports that you address that, because there does appear to be a lot of pressure on some kids who play sports these days. And as you said, and I believe that as well, that parents do have their child's best interests at heart. So as parents, how can we help take that pressure off our children?
The first thing I would say is to encourage a holistic identity. So when an athlete is incredibly competitive, especially at a young age, and a lot of times they're just driven kids who have those personality traits and maybe a touch of perfectionism too, they tend to link their self-worth to their performance. And that in itself creates pressure. So if there's ever any indication of pressure in something like a tryout or a more high pressure situation like a tournament or a big game or big race, then it feels twice as bad. And so what I would say is, if you can encourage the understanding that you are a whole person, that you bring your strengths to the sport does not give you your strengths, that you exist without it, and that you will exist after it too, then it kind of takes out a big picture look at the competition, rather than this is it, this is permanent, if I don't do this, I'm worthless. And it seems like a very strong statement, but a lot of kids have that in the back of their minds.
I like that. So they're whole without their sport. Sporting is just something they do versus I'm a tennis player or I'm a hockey player, or right. And anything else?
Yeah, I think for me, I'd say just creating sport-free zones in the home. A lot of people talk about the car ride home, as a part of that, and maybe having a safe spot where once that athlete gets in the car, they don't need to talk about the sport until they get home. That's another area where I usually give the athlete a lot of control, and in that conversation with a parent, say, when would work best for you to discuss this? And then the athlete has some input into when those conversations happen. Some kids love to talk about what went on, and they want to debrief, and they want that emotional support. And some kids just want to get in the car and put in their headphones. I've heard of athletes that pretend to sleep on the way home so they don't have to talk about what happened during a game. And I think if we can have open dialogue and say to an athlete, hey, you don't have to talk about it right now. I love you, and that's what matters most. So when you're ready, I'm here. I think that's an idealist way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Because every once in a while, it's not that cut and dry. But
what if they don't want
important.
to talk about it, period, and the parents just really does?
I think you give the space while you can,
right.
and remember that emotion and not wanting to talk about it is likely not permanent either, in the same way that emotion is not permanent. And so maybe approaching that subject later, or when things have calmed down, or saying, I'd really like to talk to you about this, but let's come up with 3 topics or 3 questions that you want to answer. Just giving them a little bit of autonomy in that system is usually helpful. And I think some athletes who are completely shutting down, that's a sign that they're really struggling internally, and maybe that's when you call someone like me and say, hey, let's facilitate a conversation together.
How do you draw the line, or do you draw the line between parents playing the role of parent and parents jumping in and coaching when the child has another coach? There are times where the parent is the coach, but in those times where there's a defined coach for the sport, these kids are working at a higher level, and there is somebody they're working with as a coach. How do you support the families in really drawing that line that the parent, even though they may feel like they have a ton of information to give, it's not necessarily their role?
Well, the first thing, again, just coming back, I would encourage the child to have a voice in it. I have some athletes that really love their parent and the amount of involvement that they have in that, and genuinely want the advice and to constantly be having the conversation. I think when it becomes more murky is when it interferes with coaching or with a team, or with that athlete's relationship with teammates and things like that. So I try to first give the athlete a voice, and then secondly, to have a conversation, even a tough conversation with a parent, and just say, hey, what do you think is helping that you're doing? And what have you noticed? What is the response when you do this? And what is the response when you say this? And try and help them come to that conclusion, because at the end of the day, every parent has their own style and is their own person, and they know themselves and their child better than anyone. So I have to make sure that I'm giving advice and working around that, kind of handing the reins over to them, asking good open-ended questions, having them come to conclusions, and always remembering that we're all on the same team. The coach is on the same team as you. They want good things for your kid, and they might be doing it in a way that you don't love, but good, positive conversations always can come from areas of conflict with coaches and even with athletes as well.
Wow, that's a lot of great information for us to take as parents, and when we're working with parents. And you're very clear in explaining what you do and how you help kids, and it sounds just fantastic.
It is pretty fantastic. It's a fun job. I get to meet a lot of different people and be a part of their lives, and kids are just the coolest. So it's pretty fun.
One of the things that I take away from this time of talking with you today, Perri, is the ability for this to really translate itself across so many different genres. So we're talking today about sport, but really we could take out the word sport and plug in academics, or we could take out the word sport and plug in art or any extracurricular activity. And the same things applied. I love your idea about you bring your strengths to whatever it is that you're doing. And we're not defined by it. We bring ourselves to it. I love that holistic place. I also love the idea of having a fill-in-the-blank free zone. So if your child's world is spent playing the violin X number of hours a day, that there are times when the violin does not enter into it. Or these are things that all of us as parents can really take forward into supporting our kids in growing and learning and becoming capable at whatever they're doing. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. If listeners wanted to find out more information from you, where is the best place for them to follow you?
My website's probably the easiest way to find the most information, and my company is called Bell Lap Mental Performance Coaching, like the last lap of a race. And so the website is just www.belllapmpc.com.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
To learn more about Parenting Power, check out our website, parentingpower.ca, visit our Facebook page, or follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Parenting Power.